Question. Who has recently read the book of Myrtle? Who has ever read the book of Myrtle? Okay. It's in the Old Testament. It's a book in the Old Testament. And it begins with these words. This is what happened in the reign of King Xerxes. Myrtle is the English name of a young Hebrew woman who stepped onto the stage of the Old Testament in around 482 BC. Her Hebrew name, you may know her by her Hebrew name, Hadassah. Anybody read the book of Hadassah? Well, she was a lady blessed with three names. Her Persian name was Esther. Anybody read the book of Esther? Oh, now we're there. Myrtle, Hadassah, or Hadassah, Myrtle, Esther. And Esther meant star. Very interesting story. And so for a few moments tonight, let's revisit the story of Esther. And I would like to see what I can glean out of the story of Esther. And it said in the beginning, it almost started like a fairy tale. When it starts with, this is what happened during. Kind of sounds like once upon a time. But it's not a fairy tale. It's a very real story with very real people. In that story of Esther, you find evil, you find intrigue, you find splendor, you find all kinds of things. Because you see in Xerxes, and it goes on, it tells you there that these events started when Xerxes had been king for 3 years. And Xerxes by that time was quite full of himself. He just was in the catbird seat. He ruled 127 provinces. And so in his 3rd year as king, he decided, I'm going to celebrate. And it's interesting that the book of Esther begins with a celebration and ends with a celebration. The celebration at the beginning, the writer tells us, was a 6-month banquet. King Xerxes threw a 6-month party for all of his nobles, all of the princes, all of the military leaders, anybody who was anybody was invited to the party. As I read about it, it kind of sounds to me like it was a 6-month drunk. Because it tells you there about all the food that they ate and all the wine, the free-flowing wine. They drank out of solid gold goblets and gold dishes, and they just had everything they wanted for 6 months. And at the end of the 6 months, well, they just stepped it up a bit for the next week or so. And toward the end of this, old Xerxes decided there was one more thing he needed to do. He really needed to show off his most prized possession, his queen. And so he called for the queen to come and display herself before all of everybody who was anybody. And she refused. You don't refuse the king. You don't refuse the king. So in short order, she was no longer queen. And then you know what happened. Xerxes was advised, well, you need a new queen. And so they went on a search for all the beautiful girls, and the word girl is what's used in Esther. All the beautiful girls in all the 127 provinces, they brought them all together. They brought them to the castle, and they placed them in charge of Haggai. And Haggai was the man at the castle who was in charge of, responsible for all the women. That's the language in the NIV. He was in charge of all the women. I cannot imagine that. I'm not even in charge of one. I cannot imagine being in charge of all the women. But that was his job. And you read there, and they went out into the highways and the byways and gathered up all the beautiful women to come for the king to have his choice. He would choose which one would be the next king. But some of those girls were country girls. Some of them, when they came into the castle, probably still had some hay in their hair, and they were a little stinky. And you read there about they had a 12-month program preparing them for an audience with the king. They had a 12-month program of perfumes and special foods to kind of get them refined. Kind of reminds me of My Fair Lady. Some of us are old enough to know the movie My Fair Lady. Well, Rex Harrison only had one girl to prepare. Haggai had, I think, maybe a few hundred to prepare. And he took a liking to Myrtle. He took a liking to Esther. He saw something in Esther that he didn't see in the others, and you read about him helping Esther. He gave Esther some additional coaching. He gave her a little better food, gave her a little better he became, I think, in our modern day language, he kind of sounds like he became Esther's mentor. Well, to make a long story short, Esther was chosen by the king. You remember that? She was chosen to be the queen. Oh, things were good. You remember Mordecai, her cousin? Now, you know a little bit about Esther's history, don't you? You remember she was an orphan. Both of her parents had died. That was not a good thing in that culture and in those days, to be an orphan. Her cousin Mordecai had taken her in and had accepted the responsibility of rearing her. Mordecai was always hanging around the king's gate. You read about Mordecai always being there. Mordecai always checking on Hadassah. How's she doing? How's she going? You read about it. Mordecai. He's keeping his eye on her, staying involved with her, staying in touch with her. And then she becomes queen. Well, then, as Mordecai was at the king's gate, he overheard two of the guards plotting to assassinate Xerxes. He told Esther, Esther told the king, and poof, those two guys disappeared. Things were good in the neighborhood. Things were just going along so well. And then the king, you remember King Xerxes promoted a noble named Haman. Old Haman. Now, if we were watching one of the old still movies where they didn't talk, this is where the piano player would play the music for the villain coming on the scene, because Haman was the villain. But Haman was promoted by the king to be the head nobleman, to be the senior nobleman. And Haman became full of himself. Haman liked being the senior nobleman. And he liked strutting around outside, and everybody knew that he was the head nobleman. And he enjoyed people bowing down to him. But there was one guy who would not bow, who would not defer to Haman. And you know who it was? It was Mordecai. Mordecai would not bow. Mordecai would not defer. Mordecai would not acknowledge Haman as being superior. And Haman hated Mordecai. Haman hated that Jew named Mordecai. Did I mention that Hadassah was Hebrew? I didn't mention that, because you know by reading the book, it's a secret. Nobody knew that Esther was a Hebrew. Nobody knew that. But Haman knew that Mordecai was a Hebrew. And so you remember the intrigue. Again, to make a long story short, Haman tricked the king, Xerxes, into signing a decree that all of the Hebrews, all of the Jews, and all of the 127 provinces would be exterminated on the 14th and 15th day of Purim, the month of Purim. Remember that? The king signed the decree, put the stamp of his ring on it. It was sent, it was posted in all 127 provinces. Mordecai saw it. Mordecai read it. Esther didn't have a clue about it. You recall how Mordecai got word to Esther. Got word to Esther of what was happening, what was going to happen a few months hence. And he begged Esther, please intercede with the king so that we will be spared. Here's Esther's answer to Mordecai. In the 4th chapter of Esther, she says, all the king's officials and the people of the royal province know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that he be put to death, unless the king extends the scepter to that person. And then she goes on, she ends her message back to Mordecai with this. But 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king. I hear her saying, Mordecai, think about what you're asking me to do. You're asking me to initiate contact with the king. That doesn't happen. It's against the law. If I go and present myself to the king without being called, without permission, the law says I'm put to death. And Mordecai, he doesn't even think about me anymore because he hadn't called for me in 30 days. So just think, Mordecai, what his reaction is going to be when I just show up and say, hey, king, let's talk a bit. Just think about that, Mordecai. My interpretation is, and you don't have to agree, but I kind of think Esther is afraid. She's been there long enough now to know how things work in the castle. And Mordecai's request, I believe, scared Esther, and she was afraid. And at the same time, I think, well, come on, Esther, look at what all has happened. Look at all the good stuff that has happened, Come on, Esther, don't be afraid. And then I stop and think, well, it's not all that unusual. A lot of special people of God in the Bible were afraid. And one of my heroes, one of my favorite heroes is Elijah. You remember about 375 years before Myrtle, Esther? About 375 years before. You remember a guy named Elijah? Remember Elijah? And old Elijah, man. You remember how he challenged 850 prophets of Baal and Asherah on Mount Carmel? Man, had a duel, had a showdown. And God backed him, and you remember that magnificent victory there on Mount Carmel. It was amazing. It was magical. It was a miracle. A mountaintop experience for Elijah. King Ahab, the king of the time, the most evil king in the history of Israel at that time, goes home, tells his wife what happened. Who's his wife? Jezebel. About in my book, about 10 times meaner than Ahab. Jezebel reacts, she explodes, starts killing prophets, sends the message to Elijah. By this time tomorrow, you're going to be dead meat. And you know what? Isn't it amazing? After what Elijah had just accomplished with God on Mount Carmel, read what it says in 1 Kings 19. When he got that message from Jezebel, by this time tomorrow, you're dead meat. Elijah was afraid and ran for his life. Oh, what a difference a day makes. What a difference a day can make. Elijah was afraid and ran for his life. Esther didn't run, but I think she was afraid. And you know the rest of Elijah's story. That rascal ran for 40 days and 40 nights. And God let him run. God even provided sustenance while he ran. You remember that? Yeah. Well, meanwhile, back at the castle. Let's go back to the castle. When Mordecai received Esther's message, we read of another message that Mordecai sent to Esther. And you read this, again, we're still in Esther 4. And Mordecai sent this message to Esther. And he said, "Who knows but that you have come to royal position for such a time as this?" Who knows but that you have come to royal position for such a time as this? That statement kind of pricked Esther's heart. She got to thinking about it. She started thinking. Maybe then she started thinking about what Mordecai had done for her. Didn't have to, but he did. Maybe she got to think, well, maybe, I wonder why I wonder why Haggai became my mentor, so to speak. I wonder why. I wonder why me, out of all of those beautiful girls, why was I selected? Maybe she got to wonder, well, have you ever had those kinds of times where you just kind of thought back over your life for several years and you wondered, I wonder why X happened the way it did in 2002. I wonder why B happened the way it did in 1991. Have you ever had, and I'm wondering if maybe that statement of Mordecai's began to generate some thoughts and some questions in Esther's mind. You know the result. She decided that she would do it. She decided that she would approach the king, even with the risk involved. So she sends this, you remember, she sent this message back to Mordecai. She told Mordecai, okay, but I'm going to fast, me and all of my household will fast for 3 days before I approach the king. And I want you to fast those same 3 days, and I want you to have all of the people fast those 3 days. We're all going to fast for 3 days before I approach the king. And she ended the message with these words. When this is done, the 3 days of fasting, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. After the fast, I will go to the king, even though it's against the law. Have you ever made a decision that serious? Then she said, and if I perish, I perish. She had decided that she was going to accept that mission even if she perished. Have there been times when you accepted missions that the results were kind of unknown and you didn't know exactly what was going to happen? Not all of the possibilities were good possibilities. There were some bad possibilities as a result of this mission. Or can you relate to Esther saying, if I perish, I perish? She had decided to do something that was more important than something for herself. She had decided to take an action on behalf of her people, for a cause greater than herself. Well, you know the rest of the story. She approached the king. He lifted his scepter when he saw her. She came in, and you know the rest of the story. You know how she used a lot of wisdom, I think, in the way that she dealt with the king. He kept wanting to know her request. What is it that you want to know? And she kept kind of putting him off. Well, you and Haman come to a banquet. I'm going to have a dinner for you and Haman. Okay, you got there. Now, what do you want to know? You know, you can have up to half my kingdom. What do you want to know? Well, you and Haman come to another dinner. Ladies, isn't it amazing how well it works whenever you just work on our stomachs? You know, she knew exactly how to handle this king and Haman. And it finally got to the point of the issue. And the king was chagrined that he had been tricked into issuing this decree. But it could not be reversed. No decree of the king could be reversed. So you know what happened? He issued a second decree giving the Jewish people the permission, his permission to defend themselves on the 14th and 15th day of the month of Purim, whenever the attacks came. And they did, and you remember they killed over 75,000 of the enemies, and they survived. You also know in there what happened to Haman. Haman was hanged on his own gallows. As a result, at the end of it, Mordecai became the number 2 man to King Xerxes. And there was another celebration. You read of the Feast of Purim. They were so grateful to Esther for achieving their deliverance that they began the custom every year of the Feast of Purim on the 14th and 15th days of the month of Purim, and they celebrate it to this day. And during the Feast of Purim every year, the book of Esther is read. Now I'm wondering, what does this have to say to an old Aggie like me? Well, one thing that jumps out to me as I read through Esther, and I read Esther from time to time. Preparation jumps out at me. Preparation. Esther and those other girls they prepared for 12 months for their audience with the king. They prepared for 12 months. And then I think about old Elijah. You remember the preparation Elijah went through? You know, he shows up on the scene, he gives Ahab the message about the famine and the drought, and then God tells him, go to Kerith, go to the ravine, you know. And he goes in isolation for almost a year, and he's fed by the ravens and gets water from a little gurgling brook until it dried up, and then God said, go over to Zarephath, and you're going to spend some time with a widow and her son over there. Think of the time that Elijah developed his preparation, his becoming a man of God. Just think about that. And there's another guy that comes to my mind on preparation. When 12 months comes to mind, or a year. Do you remember a guy named Saul? Read about him in Acts. Remember Saul? I remember about how Saul, ooh, man, he was, you talk about aggressive and assertive, extremely intelligent. You remember how he went about just killing Christians? He was convinced that this uprising had to be put down. He was killing Christians. Then miraculously he met Jesus and he was converted, became a Christian. And he continued that same zeal with Christians and preaching. And you remember how he was run out of 2 towns? Nobody wanted Saul as their preacher. They didn't trust him. And they said, Saul, go home. Go to Tarsus. Remember that? Yeah. Well, and then you remember all of the conflict and all the persecution of Christians there in Jerusalem, and they just fled. They just left Jerusalem and went in all directions. And you remember some of them settled in Antioch. You read there in Acts 10, 11, there in that area there about Antioch, and how they started a church, established a church in Antioch. And you remember how word came back to the church fathers in Jerusalem? The church at Antioch was allowing Greeks in the church. You remember what they did? They sent Barnabas. They said, Barnabas, go down to Antioch, check it out, see what's going on. We hear that they're letting Greeks in the church down there in Antioch. Go check it out. Come back and let us know what's going on in Antioch. Remember that? Barnabas goes down there, and Barnabas was impressed. You remember? Barnabas was impressed with the church in Antioch, and he stayed. And then it says there in chapter 11, that he thought, remember what he did? He went to Tarsus, found Saul, and brought him back with him to Antioch. And Barnabas and Saul stayed in Antioch for a year, preaching and teaching and helping the saints. Saul wasn't quite ready. He thought he was, but he wasn't ready. Saul spent a year with Barnabas and the Christians in Antioch, preparing to do the work of the Lord. And you remember when you read there in Acts 11, when they left Antioch, when they went on their started on their journeys, and they started on their first one, you read is Barnabas and Saul, Barnabas and Saul, Barnabas and Saul. And then chapter 13, you remember how Saul, by then he was being called Paul, how he just challenged people and had a spirit-filled sermon. And thereafter, when you read references to them, it's Paul and Barnabas, Paul and Barnabas, Paul and Barnabas. Barnabas was Saul's mentor. Saul was prepared for a year to become Paul. Preparation, so important. And I found that it's important for me to submit to preparation at each stage of my life. Because each stage of my life, I've found that I get involved in something that I maybe don't know a whole lot about, and there's someone who knows more about it than I am, who's a lot better at it than I am, and I have found the value of multiple mentors at various stages of life. And so that's something that has been really important to me out of Esther and Elijah and Saul, Paul. Look for and value mentors at various stages of life. Because I remember, I can't get Mordecai's comment out of my head. How do you know but what you were brought to this position? Brought to this point in your life? Have you ever asked yourself that? I wonder why I'm doing this at this point in my life. Why am I here at this point in my life? I never thought, I never planned to be here doing this at this point in my life. You ever had those thoughts? And I think Mordecai's point is really important. When I find myself asking myself that, it's really important to look around, find someone like a Mordecai or like a Barnabas who can help me achieve whatever it is that I'm supposed to be achieving at this point in my life. I don't think we ever reach a stage in life when God doesn't have something for me to do. I just don't think. I've become convinced that retirement is not in God's vocabulary for the Christian. Another thing is accept that you won't always understand God's plan. Boy, accept that you will not always understand God's plan. I think that was another little point in Mordecai's comment and his point to Esther. How do you know? But what you weren't brought to this position for this moment and for this issue. I think sometimes I ask why too much and too often. Well, why this, Lord? Why did this happen? Well, why didn't X happen back there? You know, why? I think maybe I ask why too often, and maybe I should just be asking what. What is it, God, that you want me to do? And I find that when I ask the what instead of the why, usually the answer becomes more clear when I ask what. Because God usually provides someone that'll help me understand the what. He provided Mordecai for Esther. He provided Barnabas for Saul. He provided the widow for Elijah. When I ask what, God usually provides a source of that answer. But I find, maybe your experience is different, but I find He doesn't often answer the why. Take a risk. Did Esther take a risk? Did Elijah take a risk? Standing up to the king of Israel, the most evil king they'd ever had, and his evil wife Jezebel. Well, he didn't stand up to Jezebel too well. He ran from Jezebel. Paul took a risk. Every city that he entered. And it's sobering when I ask myself, Tom, how many times have you accepted a risk in faith with God with the attitude that if it doesn't, if I'm hurt, I'm hurt. If I perish, I perish. When Esther decided that it was that this was a cause greater than herself, and it was worth the effort, she said, even if I perish. So I think it's really important for me to identify those causes that are greater than myself, that God is laying before me and wants me to achieve. And then celebrate. Celebrate. Isn't it interesting when we look through the Bible how God wanted His people to celebrate? He even set up certain times for them to celebrate. And did you notice I said that the book of Esther began with a celebration? Xerxes' celebration. A celebration of his wealth, his power. A celebration of Xerxes, perhaps. And it ended with a celebration. Celebrating the deliverance of God's people from evil. So maybe it's important for me to think about the source and the purpose of my celebrations. What do I like to celebrate? What do I think about celebrating. We've always, we like to celebrate. Susie and I like to celebrate. Susie loves to celebrate more than I do. She really likes to celebrate, and I'm glad because she's kind of taught me to celebrate a little bit more. I remember a time, it was during the winter, and Susie had been sick for almost a week. And our girls, the girls and I had, we'd gotten through that week. And, when Mom is sick, it makes it tough on the rest of us, doesn't it? It's kind of hard. You remember that. Well, I came in from work on Friday, and Susie was better. Oh, she was up and she was around. She was feeling better. And we all felt good. And our youngest daughter, Suzanne, said, Daddy, how about we go out to eat tonight to celebrate Mom feeling better? We like to celebrate. And I think it's good for us to celebrate. It's good for us to celebrate. Susie has a plate. It's a red plate. How many of you ladies have a red plate? Or a blue plate, or some kind of special plate, and there's an inscription on it. It's for the special person of that time. And we would have, whenever something special happened with one of the girls or with one of us, well, at dinner that night, that person had the red plate. And we celebrated that event. Whatever the event was, whatever it was that had happened, we celebrated. And I know all families have various ways to celebrate. Celebrating is important. Celebrating God. And it's interesting, in the book of Esther, you never read the name of God. He's never mentioned. But you see his hand everywhere. And I think it's important for me to remember that even if God's name is not being invoked constantly, he is there with his people. He is there with his people. So as we wrap up tonight, I think it's just really important for me to remember the importance of preparing for whatever it is and being open to whatever it is that God has for me at this point in my life, regardless of my age, regardless of where I am. Be open to mentors, be open to people that God may be using to bring ideas and thoughts and challenges to me. Taking a risk. And just accepting that I don't have to understand it all and that I don't have to know all of the answers. But I just step out and take the risk anyway, even if there's going to be some pain as a result. And celebrate the results. So important. If anyone has any need tonight that we could help you with, if you would like to just come and let us pray with you, for you, whatever, any need at all that you have, well, we just encourage you to come tonight while we stand and sing.